Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, where my co-hosts David Keefe, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Albertan and Canadian context. If this is your first time joining us, Energy versus Climate is a live webinar and podcast that drops every other week. Visit energyversusclimate.substack.com to register for updates and get exclusive access to join our live webinars, ask us questions, and engage with us directly. On today's show, we're discussing the challenges and opportunities facing Alberta's oil and gas sector in this time of double crisis, from both COVID-19 and fundamental changes to the energy sector. Now on to today's show. Hello and welcome everyone to this live webinar event from quarantine quarters in Alberta. My name is Ed Whittingham, and some of you may know me from my time heading up the Pembina Institute or the current work I do around clean energy project finance and policy. I am joined by my webinar co-host, Sarah Hastings-Simon. She is formerly the manager of the clean tech practice at McKinsey & Company, and she's now a senior research fellow at the University of Calgary and the Pembina Institute, and she has a PhD in physics. Our other co-conspirator, that's David Keefe, and David Keefe is a professor at the Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences and a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School of Public Policy. He is a founder of Carbon Engineering, which is a company developing technology to capture CO2 from the atmosphere. And he is also a PhD in physics. So I'm trying to stage manage two physicists today, which I think might be an impossible task. Today, we're going to be chatting about Alberta and Canada's energy sector. David, Sarah, and I, we're going to have a conversation on the topic du jour, which is Alberta in the energy crisis. We're going to chat amongst ourselves. We are going to field questions. We're going to put together a few poll questions to get a quick and dirty sense of what you think on some of the topics we're going to discuss. So to state the obvious, the global energy industry has been facing a twin crisis. We've got this unprecedented plunge in economic activity and demand due to the pandemic, and particularly so for oil. We've also had this market share price war and a glut of supply, and the combination of that has pushed prices down for Western Canadian Select or WTI into negative territory. And I think WCS was trading at $1.50 at the end of yesterday when I checked. So the first question is, will this twin crisis or these twin crises ultimately help or hinder the progress toward global energy transition and decarbonization? And what does this mean for Alberta's energy industry? So David, why don't you share some thoughts with us?
Sure. Well, the argument that COVID somehow helps the energy transition, the decarbonization, is that it demonstrates the ability of governments to make high consequence decisions in the public interest with real force. It shows the importance of science and rationality. It arguably pops the kind of puffy populist bubble. It actually reduces emissions by slowing the economy, and it accelerates the shift to virtual communication. So that's the argument that somehow this is going to help. I don't really buy it. I think what this shows is that people are highly motivated to deal with threats that are immediate and severe. But as much as climate is the biggest long-run environmental threat, global environmental threat for sure, it's distant. It's a spread thing. People's actions to restrain emissions benefit everybody globally in the distant future, the public goods problem, and there's no obvious body count. So my expectation is that the COVID crisis will actually slow progress in decarbonization by driving up public debt, which makes it harder for governments to do anything else. And governments are going to focus on ways to stimulate the economy fast, whatever they are. And they're going to focus on other things like medical care and bioterrorism preparedness. So I see climate as really taking a backseat for a while, sadly.
Sarah, what do you think? Is it going to help or hinder?
So I think I'm somewhere in the middle or more on the help side. So I don't disagree with David's point that obviously the actions that have been taken now are not going to be repeatable, nor should they be, right? The idea that this is how we're going to address climate and go through an energy transition is really not what we want to be doing. That said, first of all, I think it's important that we remember that we were already in the midst of a transition when we came into this. And so maybe one thing is that we all learned, in an unfortunate way, more about what exponential growth really looks like, and really can be. And so, part of it is just sort of, even if we end up going the same speed, there's, I think, a lot of momentum there. But I actually see a couple of ways that some other factors may accelerate things. So on the one hand, we are going to have some pretty significant stimulus recovery spending coming out of the back end of this. And we know that a lot of the climate, and energy transition challenges are about big investments. And so the extent to which governments are sort of ready to and already talking about how the projects and investments that they're going to make are going to be in these infrastructure projects, I think you could see an acceleration from that. I think also actually, in so much as we're pausing some of the big deployments, so I'm thinking about everything from building a lot of new natural gas plants to the fact that car sales are down. We're going to see actually a kind of pause in investment in some of these longer term assets, during which time there will still be some continued progress of, costs coming down for EVs that are already in the production pipeline and so forth, such that then when we catch up and people start going back and buying those cars again and building new power plants, I think they're more likely to, be buying things that are kind of fitting with that energy transition. So I think in some ways we may see a bit of a, kind of pause in some of that higher carbon lock-in we would have gotten otherwise.
Yeah, and this is something I'm hearing. I'd like to weigh in, but just something you said, Sarah. So with EVs, right now, if we've got oil prices and gasoline prices that we haven't seen for 10 or 15 years, I filled up the other day and it was sub 60 cents here in Western Canada. Isn't that going to slow the deployment of EVs if we imagine that oil price is going to stay low for some time?
So I think only if what's driving people to purchase EVs is, a really thoughtful lifetime cost of ownership calculation. And in a lot of cases, that's not the main thing, right? So we know that people are very sensitive to the upfront purchase price. Yes, maybe they're going to be thinking a little bit less about buying an EV because they know that gas is so cheap. But especially, if we start to get to that price, as people expect we will get to that price parity up front, then the gas costs become less of a question. So that's where I see kind of that pause, people deciding, well, I'm not going to buy a new car now, I'm going to wait. And we know that many of the big manufacturers have a lot of cars that are going to be on offer in a couple of years when, we may see sales starting to ramp up again. So I think it's a little bit more complicated than just, gas is cheap, so everybody's going to go buy giant SUVs tomorrow.
Yeah. And on the price parity, I think we'll see in places like Europe right now, they'll take advantage and increase carbon pricing. There's no better time to put on increased taxes at the fuel pumps, as much as some people might not like that, than when prices are really low. So yeah, if I look at sort of more specific to Alberta, it's clear that oil demand is not peaked yet, but I think the growth of demand has peaked. And what I see locally here in Alberta is that companies are no longer thinking in terms of hockey stick-like demand growth curves. And we already pre-COVID, we've gone through years of disruption. We've gone through the growing threat of substitution like EVs. We've had all sorts of disruption in the financial institution where, ESGs are being dictated out of New York and out of London these days. And here, pre-COVID already, lots of great companies were struggling to find financing and having tough time with their balance sheets. But I also saw like this tremendous split in the industry and between the progressive companies, those that get it, and frankly, those that thought that if we just get the federal monkey off our backs, we're going to have a return to good times, and that's all we need. Now, what I think is that latter camp has just gotten smaller. And people see locally here that we are sort of little fish in a big pond, and that's challenging for the industry. But the good thing about where we are and why I think it's going to be a good thing ultimately for a local industry is we're already way ahead on ESG things. We've had a long time to think about net zero. We've got some companies that are working toward it. And if we can actually help our companies, give them the financial space to retool, to transition, then I think our companies are going to come out ahead of this, and Canada as a whole will come out ahead on transition. What they really need is liquidity. But David,
I wish you were right, Ed, and I hope you're right, because I have all sorts of friends here in Alberta who depend on the oil patch, but I think the reality is pretty tough. I think whatever Albertans do, I don't think it makes much. I don't think there's much substantive difference between companies that sort of have a greener spin or darker spin. Fundamentally, companies make the big decisions at the boardroom inside the industry they operate on in ways that can't change very much. And the big forces, I think, are the combination of long-run climate policy globally. Doesn't matter what Albertans or Canadians vote. That won't happen anywhere near as fast as you or I would like. But we will, I think, gradually see something that pushes down emissions, and that means pushes down oil demand. At the same time, tight oil, fracking, these technologies are going to go global. Mostly they're North American now. And that means that sort of long-term supply is up. And the combination of those two, I think, means that the long-term price future for oil, and therefore the direct Albertan economic future, looks pretty grim. And, sure, we could have a war that'll knock prices up temporarily, a little sugar high. But I think the long-term future is tough. And I don't think that the kind of what local companies think about their environmental responsibility makes that difference to the ability to actually produce good jobs for people living in Alberta.
Fair enough. I love, by the way, the analogy of a war being a short-term sugar high. That's
pretty well.
Yeah. All right. Let's see what people on the line think. We've got, what do you think? Will it speed up? Speed up is 39%. Slow down is 33%. Stay about the same as 29%.
I think people did a great job on this poll. The answer is nobody has any clue, which I think is the honest answer.
I think that looks like a Canadian federal election result, those stats.
Yeah. Because the orange is winning, and that doesn't happen in Canadian general elections.
Let's move on now. So let's put ourselves into let's give ourselves absolute authority. Let's be energy czars for a moment. So the federal government came out, and last week it announced a couple measures for targeting the energy sector. One to do with methane, the other to do with cleaning up orphan wells. They announced new liquidity measures. And let's say that they got locally in Alberta from Premier Kenney and Energy Minister Sonia Savage, they got favorable responses, but clear indications that they are expecting more. So if you were Canada's energy czar with absolute decision-making authority, what would you do next? And, I'd love to hear you generally, but then also talk specifically about what you do for energy. And this time, Sarah, why don't you start?
Yeah, so I think it was a great start. I think maybe that is the only government announcement in history that got both Greenpeace and the UCP congratulating the government on what they had done. And I think, what I really liked about it is the focus on people and jobs and, things that we know are no regrets moves in terms of both cleaning up, especially on the natural gas side, the methane challenge, and then also the orphan and well challenged and active wells. What I would do, I think, is predicated on what I think and what David kind of was starting to speak to around this idea that, the challenge, if we look 10, 20 years out, yes, Canada will be still producing oil. I think that's no question. But the potential for growth, I think, is very, there's a lot of question marks there. And, no matter how good the oil companies were to get at, within the oil sands, say, at producing at, lower cost and lower emissions, as an investor looking at trying to invest in a new large project that's going to take some significant amount of time to come online, I think it's a very challenging case to make when you might have other shorter term, shale, tight oil options that allow you to respond to what's going to be, a continued volatile time going forward. So I think that the challenge that the energy czar has is how do you move forwards with that? And so I would really separate it out and say, look, we need to manage what we're doing well. So we need to get emissions down from existing production. And we need to, take the cash that's coming in from that and then start to invest in what comes next. And then also really think about what's the role for government in this kind of situation. It's not to save all the companies, right? If we believe in markets, as I do, then, the markets are supposed to say, okay, these are companies that are, better at managing and these are worse. And the role of government is really to deal with the dislocation, the problems that arise for the people that are caught up in this and help them manage through that transition more smoothly. And so, so as Energy Czar, I would sort of, kind of separate that out and say, well, I'm going to let the market do what the market does. I'm going to figure out how to support the people that are working in the industry to get through what is going to continue to be a volatile time. And then I'm going to think about how are we going to use the revenues that the industry is going to be generating, but help to create, and this is really government as a driver of industrial development. How are we going to really create the next big opportunities for Canada, which I think we'll get to talk about a little bit later. So I'll stop there.
We will. Good foreshadowing. So David, another physicist as czar, kind of like Chancellor Merkel.
I think
and Ernest Moniz and Stephen Chu. It's somehow
the last
there's
thing you want. Yeah, well, I love Stephen. He makes good martinis, but I don't think he necessarily was exactly what we needed for him. I'm going to answer not as Energy Czar so much, but to do my best as Alberta economic czar. I care about energy and climate, but I care about having Alberta work economically for my kids and their kids here. And I think the challenge is really deep. The environmental community has been, pushing really hard, lobbying. That was your job, Ed, to force the government to push to decarbonize the Alberta energy industry. To spend a bunch of money to make the oil sands have a little bit less upstream emissions by CCS or whatever, and a lot of other spending like that. I think the hard reality is that the underlying problem is the product, not the process. Oil sands emissions are in fact not much higher as process emissions than regular crude. It's higher than some, lower than others. Mm-hmm. The underlying problem is to solve the climate problem, we have to stop buying the product. And that's what the world will very slowly do, and the price will go down, as I argued. But I think the challenge for Albertans is that if we spend money to make the process of making oil a little bit better, that money doesn't help us at all. It doesn't protect our local environment very much, except for local cleanup, and it doesn't protect the fundamental viability of that industry, which I think will wither away in the long term. Yes, we'll produce oil for years, but not big new investments that make all the big new jobs. And likewise, the environmental community wants us to spend money on solar and wind projects to decarbonize the Alberta energy system. Well, that's great, but spending money on solar and wind projects where the underlying technology and high-value jobs are elsewhere, being the installers of those things, that doesn't produce the value-added, high-value economic activity that allows the sort of vibrant centers we have in Calgary and Edmonton to work. So I think we have a real challenge of thinking about what can actually produce high-value jobs where we make things that exporters want in the long run, because I don't think it's going to be oil. And just because we're good at energy now, which we certainly are, I don't think it's clear that it necessarily is clean energy. I think we have to really start from scratch and say Albertans have a very educated, young population, entrepreneurial attitudes, good work ethic. What do we do? Because it's not clear to me that just kind of cleaning up our energy industry is any kind of pathway to a viable long-run economy.
Yeah, but I mean, David, starting from scratch there, it seems that, and I'm going to channel my good friend Stuart Elgie here. I was chatting with him recently at the University of Ottawa, founder of Smart Prosperity Institute. So he was saying, Canada, like we do a once in a generation think on our economy. The last time we did that in any significant way was free trade, and we're overdue for that. So what you've said is the future isn't going to be oil, that the renewables industry, it's important, but it's not going to provide the kind of labor intensity that the oil and gas industry has provided. So process-wise, how do we come up with what that future for Alberta looks like if it's not in hydrocarbons?
Starting the conversation. I mean, I think the hard part, I don't have a magic answer, but I think the hard part is to be honest about the real questions we face. Because Alberta is filled with fantasies that the good times are going to come back, or that this is just a business of the federal government trying to screw us, and if they stop screwing us, everything will be okay. This kind of nonsense doesn't help people make real decisions. And I think the first part of understanding how to solve a problem is understanding the problem you're in and understanding what your fundamental assets are. And I think that's what Albertans have to start to do.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think the first step is actually to breathe. You know, Stuart actually wrote this really interesting thing on how we should use stimulus in Maclean's. And the rule number one was don't panic, you know, channeling our best Douglas Adams. I think don't panic, breathe, realize we got a once in a generation opportunity to invest in the economy. And that if you're the federal government right now, of course, you're not the only actor, you have a once in a generation opportunity to advance your clean growth agenda. Mm-hmm. And what I'm excited, and in the work that I do and the work that you as well, and no doubt people on this webinar, that governments are going to be making choices in the next few weeks, next few months, that I think will make or squander this once in a generation opportunity. Yeah. And the trick is to try to couple short-term economic activity with long-term benefits. And those benefits, you know, might involve helping some sectors to fundamentally retool and reposition themselves. And when we talk about the energy industry, one thing that I hear again and again is no one wants to go back to what it was pre-COVID, because pre-COVID, it wasn't in a great state. So coming out of this with anything that we do on liquidity, on new grant programs, I'm working on a tax credit that would be a Canadian equivalent of a 45Q, which is a carbon capture tax credit that works in the US. Whatever we do for energy, I think it needs to come out of this more competitive, including on decarbonization. So I think I'm a bit different, David. I'm a bit more optimistic. I'm an eternal optimist. I think there's more of an opportunity for Alberta's oil and gas sector, but partly it's decoupling hydrocarbons. And I think there's an opportunity around hydrogen, which I want to get to in a bit. But to do that, we have to do a couple things. We have to agree that some companies are going to fall by the wayside. That in the short term, if I were Energy Czar, there's no point in providing a bunch of bailout money or liquidity to companies that aren't going to make it in the first place. We got to be Darwinian. So then for those companies, there's got to be some smart consolidation. We need some big players swallowing up some of the smaller players. And then I think we need to get very targeted with our liquidity measures across BDC, across EDC, across the infrastructure bank, across SDTC, across tax credits. And all I can say is a lot of people are injecting that thinking right now into the federal system. So let's hope we get the right thinking in and they make the right choices. Okay, let's keep going. We're we've got time, I think, for one more question at the rate at which the three of us pontificate. Then I think we'd better turn to the floor and see what others have to say. So, you know, the common refrain these days is in crisis comes opportunity. We've shown that we are clearly, affected by global market forces. We're trying to compete to be a low-cost oil producer, not competing very well right now. But then, of course, you know, people want to make us competitive as a low-carbon producer of energy, not limited to hydrocarbons. So what is Canada's leadership opportunity when it comes to energy? Is it around developing pathways to net zero emissions for various industries? Is it carbon capture? Is it hydrogen? Is it electrifying industry? David, why don't you weigh in?
I think there are some potential. So I think things that are kind of the decarbonized part of that's tied tightly to the hydrocarbon expertise. So I think hydrogen production and producing hydrogen with CCS, which eventually may be hydrogen with solar or nuclear, but producing carbon neutral hydrogen and figuring out ways to use it. So for long distance trucking or other heavy parts of industry, I think that's someplace where Canada really could take a leadership position. But I think we should think kind of bigger than that. I mean, again, thinking about Alberta, I am optimistic in some ways, but I think the way I think about our assets in Alberta is we have this terrific kind of white collar engineering and management workforce that's expert in building these big, complicated projects, often in the face of public opposition. And we've got a spectacularly strong kind of blue collar trades educated workforce, all in a pretty kind of efficient economy. And I think we need to think, what can we do with that? And some of it might be decarbonized energy, but other places maybe not. And I think we need to really think out of the box. The hard reality is wages are going to need to come down a little bit to make us more competitive, but then we can be. You know, you think about places that are trying to engineer new batteries, for example, or nuclear power plants that are trying to do that out of Silicon Valley or Shanghai that are now getting to be pretty high wage places. and that don't have some of the big project engineering expertise we have, I think those are things that Alberta could conceivably compete in and win in. And I think there's also some light manufacturing that can happen here. So I think we've got to really think about what the basic assets are, which isn't necessarily something called energy. It's the kind of core assets of the workforce, and figure about what those can do to produce high value added economic activity that really sustains the province.
Great. All right, Sarah, thinking bigger, thinking what Alberta's core assets are, what do you think is the leadership opportunity?
Yeah, so I agree with David, and I would put those in my core assets bucket. I would add to them and say, we have a lot of space in Canada. We have a lot of land, and that land has a lot of resources. And when times are good, as they were in the oil market, we see that that's an incredibly lucrative place to be in, because you're basically pulling money out of the ground. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity in rethinking our resources from a much broader perspective, right? So what are, coming out of the pandemic, but even before, the US and Canada were starting to think seriously about the exposure that they have on critical metals and minerals, things like lithium, rare earths, and beyond. And the real challenges that presents, as the energy transition brings us to a place that is more reliant on those metals and minerals. And so I think that a lot of what, I think is not as promising, this idea that we could build, a low carbon oil industry, because as David said, at the end of the day, at some point, people are going to stop buying the product. But a lot of the fundamental ideas that go into that of, if we can do that in a way that is, more environmentally responsible, if we really tighten our regulations, and there's more work that needs to be done there, to be clear, but, I believe that it is possible for us to do that and to use that engineering skill and talent to figure out how to produce these materials that are going to be needed, and how to bring them, from out of the ground through some, level of manufacturing, which we also have as a competency within Canada. Then we become, a really trusted supplier for, certainly the US, which is a huge market, and beyond. So I think that thinking, more broadly about the resources that we have, which I would add is something that we've actually done before in Canada, right? And so some of the work that I've done was looking back at the, AOSTRA and the development of the oil sands. And from where we sit today, we often look at that as like, oh, well, that was really obvious because we had this huge resource. And so of course we were always in oil. And so we're going to do that. But if you go back and look at the way that people talked about that resource at the time, you get this sense for the fact that it wasn't really, thought of as an oil resource in the way that we think of it today. It was really much more of sort of a separate industry. And so I think that, we're poised to do something similar again here, which is to look at the resources that we have that are, in some form energy resources, right? Lithium is also an energy resource, and build on the, the underlying skills and capabilities we have to do that. And I think that's going to be really important, that we do present and find alternatives, because, the pushback and kind of this strange, like, freak out, I guess I would use the word that the premier had about the idea of the Green New Deal the other day. A lot of that comes from the fear, and understandably not, if you don't have an alternative, then you're going to cling to what you have. And so I think that's where, really coming up with and showing a pathway to these credible alternatives is going to be key.
Yeah. And if you're wondering about the freak out that the premier had, Max Fawcett had an op-ed in the Globe just recently about it. So, or you can tune in, and I remember it was, I think, minute 27 on the YouTube feed. It's a very interesting response to a question about energy transition, which of course is what we're talking about now. So over the last 15 years, clearly energy and climate have become hyper-polarized, hyper-political. Now, in this COVID time, we've been able to have a common enemy, kind of like the Martians attacking, which has been helped to mend rifts. But we shouldn't expect this temporary truce to last. Will post-COVID, the debate over climate and energy in Canada become more polarized, less polarized, or will it stay the same? Now, I'll weigh in just very quickly. Personally, I think there will be no climate future and no significant progress until we actually make it a nonpartisan issue, the way that, say, we've made carbon pricing bipartisan or nonpartisan issues in BC and Quebec. And the problem is in places like US or Australia or Canada, the perception amongst industry is everything's going to be undone by an election. So we need to bring all provinces on board. We need to, create that kind of consensus. And until we do, I don't think anything is going to be enduring.
Mm-hmm. I won't try to say more or less. I mean, that forecasting is so hard, but I think one thing that we may see coming out of this period is really a shifting of the kind of camps or the alliances that we had going in. And I think that's where we may see change happening, right? So we talk about kind of as if there was these two monolithic sides, but they're really made up of a lot of individual groups that for a while have, worked together and had, you look within industry, let's say, for example, and you have the large companies and their investors, and then you have the labor blue collar workforce and the white collar workforce. And so I think that those, those sorts of alliances and partnerships are the type of thing that tend to be, disrupted by an event like this. And so, as I mentioned before, I think the way that we kind of come out of this positively is both acknowledging, the value and what the industry has done for the economy of Canada to date, but then also thinking about really presenting, an alternative future that gives people kind of a choice between, going back to the way things were, which, as you said, I think, there are a lot of reasons non-environmental that many people, don't want to live on that kind of resource roller coaster.
Yeah.
We should probably get to audience questions. I'll just say, as somebody who goes back and forth between Canada and the US, I think one of the things that really I love about Canada is it just feels less bitterly polarized. I mean, the US, you really feel like you were on one side or the other of a knife edge. And maybe it's because in Canada, we war along many different dimensions. We war, prairies versus Ottawa, center versus east and west and left and right. But somehow some of the socially polarizing topics that just tear the US apart don't seem like such big deals here. So I'm more optimistic Canada can find its way out. But I think Ed, you should probably take us to some questions.
Well, and before that, let's share the poll results. So I think everyone can see them now. What do you think? On this one, we have more polarized at 46%, less polarized at 28%, and stays about the same at 27%. So not totally unlike our last one, but it just shows our audience is a little bit pessimistic as to how we're going to come out of this. Okay, let's get to questions here. Let's start and take one here. There's talk of the need for a national energy policy. Your thoughts and what should that look like?
People have wanted a national energy policy forever in Canada. I think it's a bit of I think it's asking kind of the wrong question. There's things are never polarized just around energy. The answer is energy is really important. It's, I'm an energy nerd, but it's just one piece of the economy. What you need is organized policies, I think, around innovation, around environment, around education. But I think the idea there's kind of a magic national energy policy is actually not that helpful.
Yeah, I have a story around that. I was in Ottawa in, I think, 2008. I want to say the 50th anniversary of the National Energy Board. And I asked that to Lisa Raitt, who was then Minister of Natural Resources. Do we need national energy policy? And that was when you could actually use national energy policy or national energy strategy in the same sentence. You didn't have to worry of the ghost Trudeau, the elder, coming and haunting your meeting room with talking about the national energy program. And said, well, we have one. It's environmental assessment legislation. And I wouldn't say that's a policy. It's actually in the new acts that have come, the Impact Assessment Act. It's in the mandate of the Canadian Energy Regulator. I think we need a commonly shared vision of what Canada's energy future looks like. And until then, we're going to be banging our heads against the wall. And that actually, I think, dare I say it, to use the royal, I think we could use a royal commission to look at that exact topic. It shouldn't preclude some of the short-term decisions we would make, but if I were Justin Trudeau, I'd be appointing that commission now.
Sarah, last word here.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I'm not sure what the lesson from it is, but I read a lot of angry statements from the petroleum associations in the 60s and 70s saying that we absolutely should not build pipelines to Eastern Canada. So there's something about what it is and what is the answer and how we get that right. I think that there's a lot of ways to interpret that too. I think the idea of kind of that's sort of popular in some places these days of, energy independence, and we're going to construct a strategy like that, I think is definitely the wrong way to go. I like what, David, what you were saying about, it's not, energy is not the core thing. I do think we need a national policy or set of guidelines that say, this is where we're headed with, net zero, say, for example, as for the country, because that then starts to give, all of industry the right kind of understanding of where we're going. And then, you can support them in designing the approaches to get there. So I do think we need that kind of overall guidance, right? And that is the role of government, to take that longer term view that industry is often not kind of going to take on their own for good, good reasons. They're thinking about they're responding to their investors in the shorter term. So that's what I would like to see in there is not a technology specific policy, but something that really lays out clearly where we're going, and then support for all of us to figure out, individually within the companies, how we're going to get there.
Great. Okay, let's get another question. And this is, what do you think of the Energy Futures Lab and the bright folks of the Energy Futures Lab? They've got 5 big ideas for Alberta's energy sector: hydrogen, geothermal, lithium, and bitumen, and beyond combustion.
I'll try and go through the 5 really quickly. I think hydrogen, is really plausible. I think that hydrogen is one of the pathways to decarbonization, and because we have huge hydrogen production capacity and ability to do low carbon hydrogen with CCS, I think that's something that Alberta actually could develop. I like that. Geothermal, I'm much more skeptical that the long run it's there. I think when you look at energy densities, I think there's some sort of deep arguments why I don't see it being a big part of sort of global primary energy. Now, lithium extraction, I think is really cool, but I'm ignorant, don't know that much. And finally, on bitumen beyond combustion, I'm pretty skeptical. I think as the markets for hydrocarbons for combustion go down, yes, it's true we need hydrocarbons for stuff other than combustion, including carbon fiber and whatnot. But those markets are just fundamentally small, and it's not clear that you want to start with high cost bitumen. So I respect the people who are trying to make that work, but I feel like there's just kind of wishful thinking there that won't really compete.
Okay.
Yeah, the size is a challenge, right? I think the other one that I would add to it, though, which I think came up earlier, was just like the industrial process knowledge, right? So whereas I would say, the world has to some extent solved how you could decarbonize electricity, decarbonizing industrial processes is still a real challenge. And that's something where Alberta's, engineering know-how and experience, I think, can weigh in quite heavily. So, we're not going to become the world leading wind manufacturers, but I think there we have a huge opportunity.
Yeah, let me just put in a plug for the steel and cement sectors. When I talk to people working on net zero pathways or industrial emissions, I say, well, how come no one outside of those sectors are actually working on it in any meaningful way? And the answer I keep getting back is no good reason. So I think that actually gets to possible leadership opportunities for Alberta as well.
Strongly agree.
Yep. Sarah, so will oil companies invest in reducing GHGs for existing production, or just pump oil as fast as possible? Do advancements in new technology for oil and gas production require some promise of expanding production?
So a lot of good questions there. On the first part, I think there's a real challenge in decarbonizing existing production, especially when we're talking about the oil sands facility. So a lot of the interesting technologies that people are working on and have made great progress on are much harder to retrofit onto existing plants. And so that's a real challenge, right? We're seeing obviously companies that are working to drive down costs and emissions, and things like putting in cogen to create heat are one of the promising ways to do that. But there is a real limit to how far you can go at a kind of reasonable cost on existing production. And so then, I think what we may see some is, expansion of production, existing production facilities, but the kind of really net new production facilities with the, more advanced technologies, just in today's market and even the future market becomes, I think, quite challenging. And that's where, I do think that there is that need to think about where we're investing for the future and not kind of overgoing into that area, but figuring out how to, make the most out of what we have. Let's
talk about bridging the gap between politics and policy in Alberta. the transition itself, and case in point, the Premier's reaction just the other day to that question on transition, it's framed as an ideological choice, and that seems to be a major barrier to. David, how do you talked about it's not as bad in Canada as the U.S., but how do we depoliticize this debate?
What I'm going to say sounds just very kind of like a wish and a prayer, but I really mean it. I think that some of this has to come bottom up. I think that the elites are often more polarized, and I think this won't come top down from political parties. I think that if Albertans are going to really successfully talk their way through this, they need to talk to each other. And that's, I know that sounds just trite, but I think it's crucial. I think people need to figure out how to really have these discussions at kind of local, whatever combination of social media, but I think face-to-face when we get back to it, because that seems to work better, where people really hear each other's points of view. So we get some people who are the oil patch and rural Alberta talking to the downtown tech Alberta, because if we can't find a way to talk together as individuals, nothing from the top will solve this problem.
Great. Okay. Now, here's a new question. Given the potential for natural gas to reduce emissions, should Canada take steps to increase production and export? And we commonly hear that we should be increasing natural gas. We should be increasing the capacity of our LNG ability, and Canada's natural gas can be a climate solution for the world. Now, the two of you are physicists. So, in addition to thinking of just the physics of this, I'm curious to get your take on it.
I've been doing some work actually with someone. We have a paper that's coming out at some point, looking at this, and there's definitely potential, but I think it's a lot more limited than people talk about it for a couple of reasons, right? So one is just how much room we have, in any reasonable trajectory for natural gas growth around the world. So kind of the real physics of it, if you want. So there's some potential there, but it's, at some point you run out of room even for natural gas, and you need to start driving to renewables and other lower carbon solutions. The other one, the sort of more political piece of it that I always struggle with is, if what we're saying is going to happen is that all of a sudden, China is going to pivot its entire electricity sector to relying on imports from, the US and Canada and Australia to power its economy. I struggle to see that that China, of all countries in the world, but I mean, really, we also would question doing that, is going to be happy to become so heavily reliant on outsiders for energy security, right? If anything, I think we're moving into a time when countries are more and more worried about, domestic energy security. And so even if we could, supply all the gas, and even if you were able to, use carbon capture and storage and ways to combust the gas at low emissions, I think some of the underlying geopolitics of is there really a willingness to turn over the energy supply in that way become quite a hard thing to overcome.
Yeah, I want to just really agree with that. I've been spending a bunch of time looking at big industrial scale solar, and I got to say, this is where it's great when you're just wrong. It always sort of wakes you up. I really, really thought that for years that solar was just overhyped, and all these people, enviros pushing solar on rooftops, but this fact that people are now building gigawatt scale big solar installations, a whole bunch of them going in Western China, at capital costs are going down well under $1,000 a kW, getting towards 500, and it doesn't seem like it's going to stop. The combination of that, plus, if you wanted to make cheap, low carbon power in China, so if you're competing the energy security of doing like solar in Western China, high voltage DC to bring it to the coastal China where the demand is, and then they've got lots of opportunity for pumped hydro. They're building a huge amount of that. This kind of the old tech, but still cheapest way to do storage. Plus there's, modern high tech storage. I think they'll be using gas for peaking, but I think the fantasy that they're just going to import all our gas in some kind of global liquid gas market, making themselves hostage to that global gas market and still not really dealing with emissions that much, I don't think so. I think there's certainly some window. Of course, gas is cleaner than coal, and there will be some of that displacing coal for sure, but I don't see it, and everybody else has cheap gas too. So I don't see this as kind of the most importantly, back to where I'm sort of thinking most about in this conversation, which is how this really works for Albertans or for Canadians. I don't see this as a salvation for the challenges Canada faces.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'd look at the gas question. I mean, the folks at LNG Canada and Woodfibre LNG are smart. They know they've made FID decisions based on an assumption of a certain level of demand, but it certainly isn't going to be the level of demand that we thought it was going to be back in the Christy Clark days when they had 6 to 8 to more projects slated for that part of the West Coast as a way of exciting labor and capital. And natural gas can be a solution, but a climate solution if you have good carbon pricing regimes. And once the energy efficiency or renewables start to outcompete, then its ability to gobble up market share is limited. But question to the two of you. So let's think about the future we've talked a lot about oil, but what about the future of natural gas in Western Canada? Is there much of a future? The world is awash in cheap gas. Gas has suffered from low prices for a long time. What should we do? And maybe comment on just the natural gas network and how it could be used for hydrogen as well. If that's an area we all seem to be agreeing on that we should pivot to.
Well, I think a bunch of people in Alberta are really thinking about this. I do think it's credible that Alberta could gradually transition to supplying hydrogen or hethane. There's ideas of mixtures of natural gas and hydrogen through pipeline networks that's decarbonized that people will pay a premium for. And I think while I personally am spending a lot of time thinking about solar hydrogen, I think it's much more serious than it used to be. Over the century, I think it's going to be a huge role. There's no question that for the next decades, natural gas with CCS beats solar hydrogen in producing low-cost hydrogen.
Yeah, I see it as a timeline question, right? So no doubt that there's an opportunity, especially in the near term, to definitely move away from coal and burn more gas in existing plants. I have a lot more questions about building new infrastructure, right? And I mean, similarly, things like renewable natural gas, I think are again, a good transition fuel to use the infrastructure that we have. But the long-term or, the midterm future, I think still looks more and more like a transition away. I guess with a couple of wild cards, right? So you do have some interesting things going on like this net power. So these new combustion cycle gas plants that do direct carbon capture. So that's, I think, an interesting question. But it's all, I think like all of these pathways, it's a little bit of a race between what are the alternatives, right? So maybe you manage to get those plants working. Maybe you manage to get, third gen nuclear. Maybe you manage to build out just a ton of wind and solar and high voltage transmission lines, right? I think the race is still on between those different technologies. But a big, gas is coming to save Alberta for the next 40 years. I think that's pretty much out of the question.
Yeah, people are fighting yesterday's enemy. Like, yeah, sure, gas can easily beat solar and wind back when they cost what they did 5 years ago. But as costs keep falling and storage costs gradually come down, it gets harder.
Yeah, and I've been working on a 400 megawatt solar project in the Traverse Solar Project. It's being built on a merchant basis, and that is the largest solar project utility scale under development in Canada today, and it's showing it can compete. And it'll be really interesting the next 10 years. We'll see as coal comes offline, this competition for share between utility scale renewables, between combined cycle natural gas, but also some of the measures we'll take like grid connectivity and interconnects between Alberta and BC, or look, probably more fruitfully between Manitoba and Saskatchewan, where Saskatchewan could use Manitoba as a massive storage space for clean electrons.
I was just going to say, David, you mentioned yesterday's enemies, and just going back to the polarization question, I think there's actually a real, concrete issue that we need to sort of deal with in Alberta, which I would frame as the following. So for a number of years, the big challenge that the industry was facing was the fact that they were higher carbon producers. And so the big kind of asked them was, okay, well, make oil, much cleaner, much, lower emissions. That was sort of the problem to solve. And so there was a lot of energy, directed towards that. We can debate how well, it was achieved, but that was the goal. And that was sort of almost like everybody agreed if we got there, then we would be good. And now I think there's a sense of a feeling, probably fairly from some people, that the goalposts have moved, because we realize that, we are going to need to move beyond burning the oil. And so I have a lot of sympathy for this sort of place that we're caught in, where one side is saying, well, you told us if we did this, then we would all be fine. But now you're telling us that's not enough. We need to do this other thing. But there's good reasons for that. And so I think that's part of probably dealing with that polarization and dealing with, the pushback will be kind of confronting that issue together.
Totally agree. I mean, to beat up a little bit on Ed and his former job, places like Pembina would say that the focus has to be on just these little things around the edges to reduce the carbon intensity of, say, oil sands production. But the reality is that's what they said because it seemed politically effective to say that. But the honest reality is the right loves to shout, but it's true, is that the enviro community correctly understands that the long-term answer has to be that we're not producing the hydrocarbons, that we're substituting from some other energy source. And I think that kind of whipsaw has left a lot of Albertans and a lot of Canadians pretty bitter. And that's the kind of the frontier of the debate in Canada, where the federal government and the current prime minister are not quite willing to be honest about what the just basic math of climate change means, that we're not going to be producing these resources in the long term. And yet the environmental I said it right in a way, the environmental advocacy shops have not, often hesitated to say, in a sense, the honest truth of where they wanted to go, and kind of focused on this near-term ploy that I don't think has helped that much as, I'm totally coming from the kind of long-term environmentalist point of view.
I think we should make that the focus of a future webinar, David, so you and I can have it out properly when we have more time than 3 minutes.
We left you at the end there, Ed, with
pulling
no
their
time.
hair out. But David there's no better person that can get Pembina people to pull their hair out in a constructive way. That doesn't sound oxymoronic than David. Okay, we got 2 minutes left. I'm going to squeeze in one, then we're going to get to our last poll question. So oil, I mentioned earlier, demand growth has peaked. We're still going to be combusting oil. The world is awash in cheap oil, though, and increasingly it'll be low cost, low carbon oil. So coming back to Alberta, how long do Alberta companies have to transition? Big, bold, fearless predictions. Put a date to it. When do we have to get this right? 30 seconds or less.
Oh man, I would dither and say, I think from a jobs perspective, we have, 5 years to figure out what people are going to be doing, because we're not going to be seeing growth in oil demand that's going to lead to grow, sustained jobs like we have.
I think now is the time to making these decisions in this crisis, because otherwise a bunch of the jobs just go away. I think what Alberta needs to be clear-eyed about is we're going to keep producing hydrocarbons for a long time, for decades, but we need to do that in a way that just extracts the money without really doing any environmental concessions, I think, and uses that money to do whatever we're going to do next, without being confused that that's somehow just returning the oil industry around. And basically the high-cost players need to die.
Yeah. So I'd say something similar. We've got, I think, the next couple of years to really figure it out. And given this once-in-a-generation opportunity of public expenditure, we'd better figure that out in the next few months. And it's got to be a bit Darwinian, I'm afraid to say. Thank you, everyone. I've had a lot of fun. Thank you, Sarah and David. I hope you've had fun as well. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keefe, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Voinigescu. Our title and show music is The Wind Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.substack.com. Interact with us live every other week and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen.